Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. Iran is observing the 35th anniversary of the 1979 revolution, when the CIA-sponsored Shah was replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini and the establishment of Iran as an Islamic republic. It was a pivotal moment in struggles for influence across the Middle East. It's also nearly 35 years since the U.S. began introducing sanctions against Iran. Here to discuss this historic moment is Hamid Dabashi. Hamid is a professor of Iranian studies and comparative literature at Columbia University. Hamid, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, anytime.
So Hamid, we often hear the revolution being called the Islamic Revolution. Can you actually deconstruct that?
In fact, that's the best question and the best place to start. Involved in the mobilization of masses of millions of people in order to topple the monarchy of Pahlavi regime. We're also socialists, we're also anti-colonial nationalists. Historically, you can begin the narrative that led to the 1977-1979 revolution, either with the nationalization of Iranian oil in early 1950s by Mohammad Mossadegh, which gives the revolution a potent anti-colonial nationalist element, which, as you just referred in your introduction, resulted in a CIA-sponsored coup of 1953 that toppled the democratically elected Mossadegh and brought Shah back to power in 1953. But if you begin in 1963, when the Ayatollah Khomeini led an unsuccessful uprising against the Shah, you can give it actually an Islamic element. But if you begin with early 1970s, when a very powerful a guerrilla uprising, urban and rural guerrilla uprising was involved in anti-Pahlavi struggles, will have a decidedly Marxist dimension. So in order to have a comprehensive perspective of Iran early in the revolution, namely from 1977 to 1979, you need to bring all these three forces, namely anti-colonial nationalism of the Mossadegh genealogy and Islamist aspect of Ayatollah Khomeini, and of course the Marxist element of the Tudeh party of the 1940s and Cherikhay Fadai Khalq of the 1970s, all involved at the moment of the revolution. That in the aftermath of the revolution, when the Shah was toppled, Khomeini and his lieutenant managed to outmaneuver the other revolutionary forces, and given decidedly Islamist aspect to the revolution should not be confused with the earliest stages of the revolution, whether we look at it historically from the 1950s or immediately at the time of the revolution in the mid-1970s. It had multiple aspects, which included, of course, Islamic forces, but by no stretch of imagination was limited to Islamic forces.
And Hamid, after Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power in 1979, how did the relations change between the U.S. and Iran?
Well, the relation changed because all the oppositional forces, including the Islamic forces, were united in their disapproval of the cozy relationship that the Shah had developed in the aftermath of the coup of 1953 with the United States. And in effect, the entirety of Iran was a major military base for United States regional interest. And in fact, Iran was even used as a strategic point during the Vietnam War. But also economically, during the Arab oil embargo of 1973, Iran did not join the embargo. And as a result, in the mid-1970s, Shah's income from the oil revenue skyrocketed into masses of millions of dollars, which he reinvested in the American arm industry. And AWACS, for example, you're too young to remember AWACS, but historically you know, AWACS, this radar-carrying aircraft, were in fact developed with the money that Shah gave to the American military establishment at the time from the oil revenue that he had achieved in the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo.
Okay, let's fast forward to present day. Give us a sense of the theocracy. Discuss with us, what is it actually like? Who's in power? Break that down for us, please.
You have to remember that in at least the first decade of the revolution, that is from, say, 1979 to 1989, until the death of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989, the Islamists spent initially the 444 days of hostage crisis, and after that, the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, in order to eliminate all the rivals. These elimination included mass execution of political prisoners, particularly in the 1980s, university purges, cultural revolutions, trying to bring a multifaceted and cosmopolitan political culture under control of an Islamic republic, paramount on which is this idea of Velayat al-Faqih, the absolute authority of a Shi'i cleric of highest learning, that Ayatollah Khomeini, in fact, imposed on the constitution when it was being drafted in late 1970s. In the aftermath of the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, the theocracy has continued to consolidate its forces and generate a network, an apparatus of military intelligence and security apparatus, over which presides this clerical establishment, the representative of which is Ayatollah Khamenei. And they have, in effect, occupied the entirety of Islamic Republic's theocratic apparatus. And the way that they have kept themselves in power is to make themselves very present and very indispensable in the geopolitics of the region. A quick look at the time of the revolution tells you that Americans and Europeans and their regional allies were very upset with the revolution of 1979 and began to generate two bumper zones around the Iranian revolution. One was by arming Saddam Hussein early in the revolution and encouraging him to invade and occupy Iran in 1980, a bloody war that raged between Iran and Iraq in 1980s. And as a result, what it did was prevented the spread of the Iranian revolution into the Arab world. And on the other side, they created the Taliban, which you may remember President Reagan brought the Taliban to the White House and referred to them as the functional equivalent of our founding fathers. So both the Taliban in the east, in Afghanistan, and Saddam Hussein in the west were meant to curtail the spread of the revolution of 1979. And both these events, especially the Wahhabi Sunni disposition of the movement in Afghanistan, which was meant to do two things, both to expel the Soviets at the time and also to prevent the spread of Shi'i-inspired Iranian revolution, succeeded in doing so. So the Iranian revolution, in effect, degenerated inside and became theocratic, as I just said. But these two monsters, namely the Taliban that degenerated into Al-Qaeda and so forth, and also Saddam Hussein, later on in the following decades, came back, one by invading Kuwait, you remember, that started the first Gulf War, and one by giving birth to Al-Qaeda and the terrorist activities of the beginning of the early 1990s all the way to the events of 9/11. So Islamic Republic effectively made itself very powerful, banking on the follies of US and its European and regional allies, committing one atrocity after another, whether it was by invasion of Iraq or by invasion of Afghanistan or by the second invasion of Iraq, in all of which Iran began to cultivate a soft power. And as you see today, is exceedingly powerful in Syria. It is powerful in Iraq. It is powerful in Bahrain, in Yemen, in the entirety of the region. And the question of the nuclear issue, as you know, when President Obama called President Rouhani, the least on his mind, on President Obama's mind, was actually the nuclear issue. Most importantly was to recruit President Rouhani's support for his projects in Syria in particular. To make a long story short, today Iran is internally very vulnerable because of the huge movement that began in 2009 in the form of Green Movement against its legitimacy. But regionally, it can maneuver its forces, its soft power, in a manner that makes it very useful, particularly to Obama administration and its regional allies.
Hamid, I'm so glad you brought up the Green Movement, because I want to discuss how it's been 4 years, really, since that movement faded from Iran. What struggles do you think remain for Iranian citizens?
In fact, to become full citizens and to become capable of changing their administration with element of trust in the government. They didn't trust the last election, but they invested their trust in Rouhani. There is a minimum of trust in this recent election, and as you see, whether it is internally or regionally, Rouhani is beginning to have a far different administration to Ahmadinejad. But it doesn't mean that Iran is now all hunky-dory. There are still political prisoners of consciousness. The press is not free. Women's rights issues are very much under pressure. There has just been a labor unrest in Iran, which has been severely crushed, and the leaders of it have been arrested and put in jail. The students' organizations are under pressure. The three forces that can actually challenge the theocracy are student movements, women's rights movements, and labor movements. And it is precisely those three movements that the ruling regime is not tolerant. It has now an administration which is far more palpable in terms of its affinity with popular demands in the figure of Rouhani, but in terms of its infrastructure, which remains theocratic, it has not changed. However, by virtue of shifting the focus from the internal affairs to the regional issues, as you know, the entire region is in jeopardy, not just in Syria, but in Egypt, in Bahrain, all over the place. Iran can manipulate the geopolitics of the region in a manner that, because it is indispensable to the United States' interest in the region, can camouflage its internal issues.
All right, Hamid. In part 2 of our conversation with you, we really want to discuss the Iranian nuclear negotiations. So please, viewers, check out part 2 of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Hamid.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.